the science department of the World Health Organization experienced substantial strengthening, emphasizing research, standards, quality, and digital health. She played a crucial role in shaping the organization's strategic focus. During the rapid spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Swaminathan effectively coordinated WHO scientists and championed initiatives like COVAX, ensuring equitable vaccine distribution in low and middle-income countries. Beyond her administrative role, Dr. Swaminathan, a distinguished pediatrician, has dedicated over 3 decades to researching tuberculosis and HIV. Her impactful tenure as the Secretary to the Government of India and Director General of the Indian Council of Medical Research has enhanced research capabilities in Indian medical schools and contributed significantly to shaping government health policies. Dr. Soumya Swaminathan's influence extends globally, demonstrated by her role as a national and global consultant to various organizations. As the author of numerous books and an esteemed fellow of the US National Academy of Medicine, the UK Academy of Medical Sciences, and several Indian Academies of Sciences, her intellectual prowess is widely recognized. Awarded multiple honorary doctorates, Dr. Swaminathan serves as an adjunct professor at esteemed institutions like the Karolinska University in Sweden and the Tufts University in Boston, USA. Her intelligence, management skills, and leadership in the field of science serve as a guiding light for future generations. We extend our heartfelt wishes for her continued good health and a long, prosperous life. It is a great privilege to have us with you here today. I welcome you to the city of Mumbai. I welcome you to the YB Chavan Center, and I request you now to address this gathering.
Namaskar. Respected Sharad Pawar ji, respected Supriya Sule ji, Dr. Kakodkar, Dr. Mashelkar, and there are so many of you in the audience, the trustees of the YB Chavan Foundation, and dear ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me say what a privilege and honor it is for me to be here, and especially receiving this award that so many eminent Indians have received before me. So I feel extremely humbled by this honor. And I would like to thank the trustees of the foundation for having selected me for this year's award. It's also a privilege to be able to interact with you all and share some thoughts. And he made a very kind and very generous introduction of me, but it is true that in the last few years during the pandemic, I was privileged to be in a position that probably nobody can dream of being, because obviously nobody expected a pandemic would come and at this particular time and this particular nature. But what was more interesting about it was that the WHO, which is a 75-year-old organization, it was created after the World War II, just like the other UN agencies, and it's the only international normative agency on health. And countries around the world look to the WHO for the standards, guidelines, and recommendations. And it was for the first time in 2019 that the position of a chief scientist was created, even though from its very beginning, science was in the DNA of WHO, and everything that the WHO says or speaks about is very much underpinned by science and by data. But there was no explicit focus on that. There was no one person representing science, and there was no science division. So it was an enormous privilege for me when the Director General invited me to move from my position as a Deputy Director General, which of course sounds very grand, to a position of Chief Scientist, which actually had much more tangible things that I could do. And that too, it was in March of 2019, and as we all know, 8 or 9 months later, we had the outbreak of this new virus causing pneumonia in Wuhan. And it was over the Christmas holidays that we came to hear about something strange that was going on. And by January 10th, we knew that it was a novel, a new coronavirus that had not been described before. And no one had laid out what a chief scientist should be doing during a pandemic, because this had never happened in the past. And so it turned out that I had to create the contours of the job and of the division, but also there was this wonderful opportunity to focus on the science during the pandemic, to understanding the virus, to understanding everything about it. Where did it come from? Of course, we still don't know. I must admit that that question has not been answered. I think that's the one remaining question. How did COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, originate? Which animal? We know it probably came from a bat, but how from a bat, through which animal did it come to humans? And when and how did it mutate so that it was able to spread from human to human? I think this understanding is going to be important for us for the future, for pandemic preparedness, because we are seeing more and more the jump of viruses from animals to humans for a number of reasons, including the fact that we human beings have taken over the space which originally belonged to animals. If you take Ebola, for example, it's a disease that's been around for a very long time. And again, it's HIV also originated from the forests in Africa, where the related viruses circulate in chimpanzees and monkeys without causing them any severe disease. People were trading in these, eating them, of course, killing them, and that's how the HIV virus actually got into humans. Similarly, the Ebola is also spread by the same primates and by contact of blood. But in the old days, what would happen is a small community living in the heart of the Congo forest would get exposed to Ebola, and there may be 3, 4, 5, or maximum 10 people in that little hamlet or village who would get it and who would die. But today, with globalization, the fact is that a virus that originates in any remote corner of the world, it's estimated that within 24 to 36 hours, it will travel around the world. There is nothing we can do about it. That's how we are closely linked now. And so there's that, there's urbanization, there's the loss of biodiversity, again, all contributed, of course, by humans. There is climate change. So there is, especially for vectors of diseases, they are adapting their behavior. The malarial mosquito today is able to survive in places where it could not survive earlier. You find dengue, chikungunya, these kind of viruses, which are also mosquito-borne, are spreading very rapidly. It's the most rapidly spreading infectious disease, in fact, globally. And then you have the emerging viruses. There are at least about 30 families from which it's possible, or it's either happened in the past or it can happen in the future, that we can get, human beings can get infected. And influenza was considered the biggest threat because all the previous pandemics, starting with the very famous Spanish flu, which is wrongly labeled as Spanish flu, but everybody knows as Spanish flu around World War I. And then we've had several influenza pandemics after that. The last one being 2009, the H1N1. It was not very severe, and so it did not turn out to be a very serious pandemic. But the fact is, influenza viruses are known to mutate, and we know that they can jump from other animals into humans and cause either epidemics or even pandemics. But there are a number of other viruses, like the coronaviruses, of which there are thousands in the wild. The bats are a very rich reservoir for coronaviruses. And we've had two previous coronavirus outbreaks, the SARS outbreak in 2003-04 and the MERS, or what is called the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. It's spread through camels, and it's an episodic, it's there. It's not a pandemic, but it exists, and it's got a high fatality rate, and there's still no vaccine or good treatment for it. And then the third one was this SARS-CoV-2. So it's possible that apart from influenza, we have corona, and then we have a whole lot of other viruses. We've seen Nipah outbreaks in India in the last few years repeatedly. And thanks to the fact that Kerala has a very good surveillance system, but also a very good public health response mechanism, we've been able to contain the Nipah outbreaks without very extensive, too much of mortality or spread. But the point is that because of all the changes that I just described and the way in which we interact today with nature, future pandemics are going to be very likely. It's a question of when and not if, and therefore we need to be prepared. People also ask me, a lot of people still believe that this virus was either engineered in a lab and released. There are lots of conspiracy theories around that. But of course, it is possible that there could have been a lab accident. Lab accidents do happen. They've happened in the past, and they can happen in the future as well. So you do have the risk of an accidental release of a pathogen, but you also do have a lot of bad actors or players out there who might want to, and today with the tools that we have of biotechnology, of genomics, and the simplification of the molecular technologies, it is possible for someone at low cost, not needing very sophisticated labs, to be able to create pathogens. It is not impossible to do that. And with the kind of understanding we have now, and also the use of artificial intelligence and so on, all of this has got speeded up. So this is where, again, there are a lot of boundaries and the blurring of lines in terms of the ethics of certain kinds of research. And so one of the things that I did do at the WHO was to create a framework for this kind of research in biology, which also intersects with, if you take biology and biotechnology, and you also take the digital tools that we now have, like AI and machine learning, and you put the two together, then it's very potent. And so you do need an ethical and regulatory framework that governs the use of these new technologies. For example, if you remember a few years ago, there was a Chinese scientist who used gene editing, actually, to create embryos that lacked a particular receptor, so that those babies would be born resistant to HIV infection, because they don't have the receptor for the HIV virus. Now, it's one thing to do this in the lab, but another thing to actually experiment on real embryos, and these embryos were then taken to term and delivered as babies. These are twin babies that were delivered with this genetic manipulation, which essentially is a change you make that gets carried on to further generations. And we really don't know what is the impact of this one change you've made, this one mutation on a cell receptor, that yes, maybe it does prevent you from getting HIV, but we know there are many other ways to protect ourselves from HIV. We don't need to change the genes of a person to do that. And in the future, what that's going to be implications for this child and the child's life, and also for the future generations which will be born to those children. So this, of course, created worldwide huge outcry. All scientists uniformly condemned this type of unethical experiments. He was put into jail, etc. He was paid a heavy price for it. But the fact is that gene editing and such gene therapies do have a role to play. There are diseases which can be cured today. We can think of curing sickle cell disease, thalassemia. This is already happening in the world. And therefore, these technologies are extremely powerful and can do a lot of good for humanity. But they also have, each new technology in the history of humankind, when it comes with all its potential, it also comes with a power of destruction. Whether you take fire, which was a creation of man, of course, it changed the lives of people who lived on this planet, but fire can be used also to harm. And similarly, every new technology, it's nuclear, we just heard that Oppenheimer won all these Academy Awards. And the kind of soul-searching those scientists also did when they saw that their invention had resulted in the deaths of, lakhs of people. And that was, I'm sure, on their conscience till their last days. So this is why I think it's important to embrace technology, but to also have the ethics, the ethical views, and a debate within society as to how to use these technologies. And I think we don't have enough of a debate around the use of new technologies, where society would like these to advance. And there is a lot of debate, I must say, about AI and about the need for regulation. So at least in that space, I think even a lot of the top tech companies, heads, etc., speak about, even the ones who are developing AI, they do express the need for a regulation of AI. So I got diverted a little bit, but essentially it was about science and building the science portfolio, and not just talking about lab experiments, or mutations or variants. Everybody talked about COVID variant, etc., but about the other side of science, which is also the ethics. And so we paid a lot of attention to that during the pandemic, and we had a very active bioethics working group consisting of people around the world who came together to talk about questions that were being asked by people. For example, some countries wanted to do mandatory vaccination. What's the ethics around mandatory? When do you make something mandatory? When are you crossing that line? When you have to compare a public health benefit versus an individual benefit or risk, then who is allowed to make those decisions? In what circumstances could you justify something to be made mandatory? So this was a question that was debated, and a paper was produced. Similarly, there was the whole concept of human challenge studies. So human challenge studies basically are like, if you're a healthy person and you volunteer for a clinical trial and you get exposed to a pathogen, whether it is malaria, typhoid, cholera, or in this case, COVID, you would be exposed to it. So voluntarily, you would take a shot of that or you would inhale it, and then it's a way of testing the efficacy of a drug or a vaccine. So you would be given the vaccine, and then you would be exposed to this, and then the scientists would study what happens to you, how many of you are protected from this. So this has been done. In India, we don't have any center doing human challenge studies. I think we're trying to set some up, but you do find around the world that there are studies going on, and it makes it very fast. Actually, it can cut down the speed of vaccine or drug development, because you don't have to wait for somebody to get infected. You are infecting them, and so very quickly you can complete these trials. So it can advance, but it's a big ethical issue. And so I remember we had groups from the UK and the Netherlands. These were mainly youth groups writing to us saying, we want to volunteer. Why aren't you letting us volunteer? Because we are young and we are healthy and we don't think we are at high risk, and we want to help to develop the vaccine. So do the experiments on us, and then that way we'll be able to save a lot of older people who urgently need the vaccine. So, there was a lot of altruism also during the pandemic. People wanted to help in different ways. So again, there's no right or wrong. There's no yes or no answer in this case. There's, again, the ethics of how you look at such a thing, how do you do the decision making, and how do you best protect these volunteers? Because you don't know whether this vaccine is actually working or not. So in such a situation, how do you offer the best protection to them? So then there were also ethics around the use of tracking on mobile phones. Everybody was asked to download apps, and in some countries, the government was using those apps to monitor for other things also, not just for COVID. And so some governments were using that authority which they had during COVID, not in India, but other countries. And so people were a little concerned about all the privacy and the lack of availability of their private information. So there was a paper around that. So what I saw also was that there was tremendous international collaboration, at least at the level of the scientists. We all know that there was a lot of politics, and that the pandemic was politicized in many ways, and we saw a lot of inequity as a result of nationalism and so on. But as far as the scientists were concerned, I think they all had the same goal, which was to find some solutions quickly. And so whether it was people developing vaccines, people working on the new variants, people developing treatments, or people trying to understand the transmission, everybody wanted to work, and people were working day and night, and they wanted to share the information with WHO. As soon as they got it, There was no holding back. There was no, let me publish this paper before I share this data with anybody. All that was not there. And every night we would have calls with people from around the world who wanted to share their latest knowledge that they had gained by experiments. Thank you. So that was very positive. And maybe a last observation which relates to everything that we will be doing in the future is the whole area of misinformation and disinformation. And I think everybody experienced during the pandemic, I'm sure all of you must have received at some time a WhatsApp message with some very outrageous messaging, like, for example, this whole vaccination campaign is basically Bill Gates injecting chips into everybody so that he can then control the world. That was one of the rumors that was going, that if you take the vaccine, you'll also get a chip, and then somebody sitting somewhere will be monitoring you. And so, especially around vaccines, there was a lot of misinformation. But even otherwise, I think that is a phenomenon that has also existed from a long time. It's not new. And so we've always had some anti-science, anti-vax movements and all. But now what happened is, because of social media, it actually gets spread very quickly, which was not the case in the past. So I think that's the major difference historically. So today you start something, and then especially if it's extremely, the more outrageous it is, the more rapidly it spreads on social media, and people forward and forward. And this had very negative repercussions in many countries, where people got so frightened of taking the vaccine that even after it was available, actually we were shocked, because we found that even before the first vaccine was licensed, this anti-vaccine movement had already started. And as we were tracking vaccination, we found that in the US, for example, which had no shortage of vaccines, they had vaccines right from December of 2020 onwards, and they had a whole range of vaccines and enough volume. 40% of the population outright refused to take the vaccine because they believed that, well, they didn't think it was going to protect them. And so many of them died, and, but till today, I mean, that is a very strong, similarly in Europe, many countries, and because of that, this kind of thing also spread to Africa. I think India was very fortunate, firstly, that we had such a wonderful vaccination program run by the government, absolutely flawless. We had our own vaccines, and we ran the program, and we achieved the goal of vaccinating 70% of the adult population, in a record time. And yes, there were pockets where people were reluctant, but those were overcome, by the local authorities, talking to the community leaders and sorting it out. So we didn't face the kind of issues. I know in West Africa, for example, many countries, the French-speaking countries of Africa received a lot of the information from the gossip and the rumors from Europe. And they were convinced that these are all very bad vaccines that are being sent to Africa, and that the good vaccines were all taken up by the West, and that all the rejected vaccines were going to Africa. That was what a lot of them believed, and so we had vaccine coverage rates of 3%, 5% in many of these countries. So actually misinformation is not just irritating thing, it's actually very dangerous, because it can affect people's health and their lives. And so I think we have to be very careful, because going forward, it's not just a pandemic that is linked to this. There is, it can affect every aspect of our life, because misinformation, it distracts you, and it makes you very negative about things. So climate change is, I think, even more than pandemic, I would think, put climate change as the #1 risk today for not just our health, but our very existence on this planet. And the kind of predictions that one reads, of course, can make you extremely anxious and worried. And there's a whole terminology now of eco-anxiety, especially among young people who believe that the world is no longer going to be a beautiful place for them and for their children to live in. And so this eco-anxiety is a real, I have psychiatrist friends who tell me that they often see teenagers and young people who have this eco-anxiety, which keeps them up at night, gives them nightmares and things like that. And that's because we read so much about the negative impacts of climate change. It is all true, but I think we need now to work on solutions. And there are solutions. It's not that we just have to sit back and wait for bad things to keep happening. And I think there's a very small window of opportunity. On one side, of course, is the mitigation, which is what is globally mostly discussed. How do you reduce CO2 output? How do you get to, net carbon zero, etc. And all of those targets, how each country is going to meet them, etc. That's what the focus is. But unfortunately, the reality is that many people today, especially in the developing world, are already facing the impacts of climate change. We talked about vector-borne diseases being one. Heat and heat impact is another big one, which for India is very relevant because now we're getting into the summer and you will see that the number of heat wave days is going to increase year after year. It will be more prolonged. The night temperatures are going to be higher. And in cities like Mumbai and Chennai, where I live, the humidity factor actually adds to the impact of heat on our systems. And there is a certain level at which our systems cannot function. The cardiovascular system will not be able to function anymore because the core temperature goes to a point where these things start shutting down. And so that's when you get into heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and of course this can lead to death if it's not recognized and treated. So I think we really have to start thinking about how are we going to protect people now, today, and tomorrow from the impacts that we are already seeing. Heat is one example. Another one in agriculture, of course, is the yields of a lot of our crops. We see the projections that the yields of rice and wheat and everything is going to go down, and the cropping patterns are changing. So the farmers have to sow at a different time and reap. They can't follow the old traditional ways that they were used to of doing agriculture. And so this is where we need to use technology to better inform and guide people, whether it's an individual trying to protect your own health or whether it's a farmer who wants to know when they should plant and how they should do and when they can water and when is the monsoon going to come, etc. So they need advisories which are very relevant for them for today. They don't want to know after 6 months what is the weather going to be. They want to know today and tomorrow, what should I do? And so I think we have to, all our systems need to, now we've got wonderful digital infrastructure that we all saw was used very wonderfully during COVID. We have a wonderful telemedicine and telehealth, which was also used a lot during COVID. There were apps, there were many things that were, a lot of innovations that came, the kind of diagnostics you could not imagine that within 2 years you're going to have a diagnostic which you can wake up in the morning, test yourself and know whether you have COVID or not before you step out for the day at a very affordable price. And Dr. Mashelkar and I were talking earlier about affordable innovations made in India, not just for India, but for the world. But for a disease like tuberculosis that I've worked on for all my career, we still don't have a point-of-care diagnostic test. People still have to go somewhere, wait, give the sputum goes somewhere else for testing, then the result comes, then they may or may not get the result, then they're told to go for an X-ray, they may or may not go for the X-ray, and then they fall between the cracks. And it's very sad that, we still have about 500,000 people dying of TB every year. And a lot of people don't realize that. They think, well, TB is gone long ago. We never hear about TB, yes, because the media and the press don't write about TB. But they will write about every dengue death which happens, because it happens in cities and it happens to people who are quite well off. TB deaths are silently happening out there in the remote rural and tribal areas. In our urban slums, Mumbai is the capital of multi-drug resistant TB. And again, it's a man-made problem and we need to be able to solve that. So again, the technologies that we all developed during COVID can be used now to address some of our other major public health problems, and also problems like climate change, which of course needs a lot of innovation. So on the one side, we've still got our basic needs like drinking water. Water is going to be another big issue. We know there's going to be water shortage in many parts of the country. We need to address that very urgently today. Sanitation, we've done a lot. There's still a last mile to be covered. And on health, we have malnutrition, anemia, and a growing burden of overnutrition. So on the one hand, we still have millions of people who are undernourished, and unfortunately now millions of people who are getting overnourished and obese. And that's also leading to problems with diabetes and so on. So we are, as we develop, I think we have to find our own pathway, which is living in harmony with other species, whether they're marine or whether they are land. Our flora and fauna are important, because without biodiversity, without nature, I think we will not have a good quality of life either. So I think with that, maybe I will turn it over to you for any questions that you or the audience might want to ask. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan, for that talk. We got a compressed lecture on the history of infectious diseases, of vaccines, of the amazing spirit of humankind to endeavor to find solutions, of collective action in the face of a crisis, of the emergence of technology and what it means, the good and the bad, of the new emergence of climate anxiety amongst the youth, and also a lot of hope. We still have some more questions, though, for you. I think we can do a panel. Is there one more mic? Okay. So if we have the time. Yes.
Thank you for a nice speech. Just want to ask you how AI could be regulated or controlled. Is it possible?
Sir, if I had the answer to that, then I think, yes, I would be more famous. But no, I think it's a very good question. And the fact is that a lot of people are struggling with this. I think the European Union probably is the most advanced in terms of AI, regulating AI. But it's not easy because, of course, AI is also changing all the time and getting... So I think what we need probably is transparency. I think there are some principles that need to be applied to the development of AI, and any developer has to be held accountable to follow those principles. One is, I think, the transparency of how did you develop this algorithm, and very importantly also, on what databases was the AI trained. For example, we know the risk of bias in the algorithms is very real. So if you train an algorithm in one part of the world, let's say in a Caucasian population, I'm talking about an application for human health, and you bring it to India or Africa, it may or may not work. Because, and they've also found a big gender bias in a lot of the AI-based algorithms, which are often trained on male databases. So I think knowing about that, and then being very explicit about what the goals of that algorithm are and what the limitations are. And I think also there are a lot of legal issues, especially in the field of medicine, when AI is going to be used to predict treatment and so on. The hospitals and the doctors, normally the doctor is liable. Now, if the AI is dictating the treatment, then who's going to take that liability? So some of these discussions, I think for each field in which it is applied may be a little bit different. But I think the most important one is probably the transparency and the openness. So the fact that it's not a black box that... and that's what I think OpenAI is probably trying to do.
So we'll just finish with a few panel questions, and then we can open to the floor. So if you all can be patient for 5 minutes. There's a few general questions we'd like to ask you. India, we're on the cusp of becoming a $5 trillion economy. We have grand ambitions. This is our time to shine. But there will be a lot of infrastructure development. Our energy needs are going to go through the roof. A lot of these things will contribute to climate change. At the same time, we have emerged as a world leader. The world sees us very differently. Therefore, we also have a responsibility to the global movement to meet the targets. You addressed a little bit of it earlier. How do we do this tightrope walk as a country?
I think the good thing about India is that we have a long tradition of sustainable living and recycling and not wasting, and also if you look at the ways in which our houses were designed in the past, they were built for the local environment and the weather, so that even in the summer months, you know, as children, we obviously did not have any air conditioning or anything like that. We had fans, and you still were able to survive. Now, today, when you see buildings being built with a lot of glass, it is probably the worst thing you can do in a tropical country like ours. Similarly, I think when you look at water, and if you go to the south and you see the way that, you know, the Cholas had the water systems that was developed at that time 1,000 years ago, the system of canals and lakes and everything was flowing into each other, so that neither you had floods nor you had droughts, and all the water was conserved. You had the village wells, you had the ponds. So I think we have the answers, but we don't have to reinvent. But we need to be sensible about how we, for example, we're building a lot of housing now. Are we building in climate resilient features, you know, into our housing? And I'm particularly concerned with the housing that's built for the low income groups that are often lack any ventilation and lack any means of cooling, you know, themselves. And so they're going to be a lot of very vulnerable people.
Thank you. You partly answered the next question, which is follow-up. We're in Mumbai today. Mumbai is a financial engine, has been for some time, but we have been cyclically vulnerable to flooding and extreme weather events. We've also been hearing for so many years about sea level rise, and this is going to go and that is going to go. India has a very long 7,500 kilometer coastline. We have very important cities, your hometown as well, Mangaluru, Kozhikode, Kochi, very important port cities. How are they differently vulnerable? That is the first part of the question, to the rest of the hinterland. But also, most of our cities have very large slum populations. 6 out of every 10 Mumbaikars lives in a slum. How are they differently vulnerable to climate change?
So I think as far as vulnerability, so when you talk about climate change, we have the hazards, which are the events, the climatic events, whether they are the droughts or the floods or the cyclones or the heat. Then you have the vulnerabilities, which are related to where you live, how you live, you know, what resources do you have to protect yourself, but also things like age, gender. So, for example, elderly and the young children are more vulnerable to heat, as are pregnant women. And then your coping and adaptation mechanisms, and how much flexibility do you have to be able to change your environment in a way in which you are not so badly affected. So do you have access to cooling in your home? Do you have access to water, etc., to sanitation? But I think so when you look at, when the question is that if you have many of those risks and vulnerabilities, then any disaster, you know, you're going to suffer a lot more. If you take even the pandemic, a lot of people made money during the pandemic, right? Especially the tech companies and the pharma companies. And the majority of those who lost were the poorest in all countries. You know, a couple of 100 million people were pushed further into poverty because of the pandemic. So it's always the bottom part of society. And so I think when we think about how we want to build and live, we have to start with that. That's where the equity, I think, has to come into all aspects of our planning. We talked a lot about equity during the pandemic, was about vaccine equity. But I really feel that equity has to, when we think of a new project, we must ask that question of, is it going to make it better or worse, you know, for the people who are already most vulnerable? And all the floods and things which we've been experiencing recently, yes, it's because partly climate, because now many of the places are getting the same amount of rainfall you would have got in a month, we now get it in 1 or 2 days. This is the new pattern of rain, and this is likely to continue. So our systems are not able to cope up with that volume of rain because we've narrowed all our canals and rivers and outlets because we've constructed everywhere. Chennai, for example, is constructed over the entire backwaters that we have. So the water has nowhere to go. So it has to come into our homes now. So like I said earlier, I think we've created the problem. We now have to solve it.
I think Mumbai and Chennai sound more like sister cities after this. We don't have much time, so just a couple more questions. Again, something you touched upon already. Ours is a multi-millennial civilization. We have a wealth of traditional knowledge systems and sustainable lifestyle practices, particularly our heritage of agriculture, of fishing practices that have been passed on from generations to generation together. How can we convert this traditional knowledge into useful application in the pursuit of sustainable futures, and more particularly towards resilience and adaptability to combat global climate emergencies?
So I think that's a great question, and I think we did touch upon it earlier, the fact that we have traditional knowledge, and the traditional knowledge resides within our, a lot of it resides within our farming communities, especially the small farmers and the tribals. So if you go into the tribal areas, their old ways of life were completely in harmony with nature. They knew every plant and they can tell you what each part of each plant can be used for in terms of its medicinal or nutritional properties, and they only took as much as they needed and etc. You know, but of course now we're living in a very different world, but I think we're losing that knowledge. So one of the things that many NGOs especially are trying to do, I think, is to capture that knowledge. And of course the CSR had this, you know, this whole TKDL platform where on a digital space now there's a lot of traditional knowledge that's been captured. But we need to use a blend of traditional knowledge with the modern tools and technologies, I think. And again, it'll be different for each agroecological system, because you talked about agriculture. The farmer has a traditional way of doing things, but certainly farmers can be helped with new technologies, particularly seeds. You know, the whole thing with hybrid seeds is that they're dependent now on a particular type of seed. Every year they have to buy it. Whereas the traditional system was that they conserved a lot of their own native varieties of seeds, and they would share that, and they knew which seeds would grow well in what season and which had what properties and so on. So I think, unfortunately, with the modern commercial way of doing things, we've lost some of that. And certainly at the MSSRF, I think the focus has been always on marrying traditional wisdom with modern technologies, and we call it eco-technology.
Thank you. We had a lot of questions about the tremendous work that you've been doing at the MSSRF, and you're one of the rare institutions that has been able to find linkages across governments, regional, local, national, and beyond boundaries of India. It's fascinating to see the journey that you've had there. Unfortunately, we have time for just one more question. And we've got a lot of younger people coming in. So this is, in 87, the UN defined sustainable development as the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs, or compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. 36 years later, and after Greta's outburst, youth are taking up the cause of climate action more than ever. Climate anxiety has become a prevalent problem that you touched upon. What is your message for young Indians as they prepare to navigate an uncertain future full of terrifying possibilities?
So I think they can probably speak, they know, you know, what they would like. But my message would be that, you know, we have to be positive and hopeful. We cannot give up and say that all is lost, because I don't think it is. And so, like I said, we've created problems. We can also find solutions. The kind of tools we have today in terms of information technology are unimaginable even a few, 10 years ago. And so that's a huge advance, that you can put knowledge today in the hands of people at a speed at which it was just not possible to do in the past. And therefore, we can create mass movements. And if we could create a mass movement, which is what many of the youth we see are already doing, the climate activists and so on, in living a more sustainable lifestyle. This is something, of course, our Prime Minister talks about also, the life principles, where we are living basically in harmony with nature. And again, going back to Gandhiji's thing of there is enough in this world for everybody's need, but not for everybody's greed. And so if everybody followed that kind of philosophy, then I think there wouldn't be a problem. But this would require a massive behavior change, essentially.
Can I ask one question?
Yes, to the floor. Now we can take 2 or 3 more questions and then we'll have to close.
May I start? Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan, for a very enlightening discussion. First, your brilliant lecture and followed by very insightful answers that you gave to great questions raised by Mr. Kirtane. In the earlier part of your speech, you talked about the ethical dimension of new technology. How do we, my question is this, the technology is going ahead with a breakneck speed and there isn't enough discussion or awareness about the ethical dimensions of this growing or rapidly improving technology. What can be done to promote the ethical dimension? How can we create more awareness about the ethical dimension? That is a question I would like to raise. Thank you.
So it's a very difficult question, and I would appreciate also, any inputs and suggestions. I do think that as scientists, we have a responsibility. So scientists who work in different fields and who are experts there, I think when we understand the technology much better, obviously if you're working on gene editing, then you will know all the technical details of gene editing. We, in our, I think, educational system, I believe that we neglect the social sciences. And so, for example, when I studied medicine at one of the best medical colleges in the country, the AFMC in Pune, I don't think that there were serious lectures on ethics, on social science or behavioral science and the importance for... It has to become a part of the curriculum, I agree. We used to have these moral science classes and all when we were young. But that was a different way of teaching. But I think it's to make you question. And I must say that some schools, like the Krishnamurti Foundation schools, the way they teach children is basically you have to ask all the very difficult and the right questions. Nobody is telling you the answers. You have to self-question yourself as well. So I think that critical thinking is something that needs to be brought in at the school level. And probably even at the postgraduate level, we are lacking that in India. And this is not just in science, but I think across, to have a population that is scientifically literate. Everybody doesn't have to be a scientist, but all you need to do is to have some rationality about the way you think so that you don't believe everything that you're told.
So as a landscape architect, I found it very interesting that you pointed out the fact that coexistence and the boundaries that are crossed, are crossed has led to the emerging of many of these pandemics like Ebola and what you spoke about. So would you say that, we need to go beyond climate resilience to maybe nature positivity in how we plan our cities? And is any of the work that you do at the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation leading towards that?
Please introduce yourself also.
Yeah, I'm Urmila Rajadhyaksha, a landscape architect from here in Mumbai, and currently serving as the president of the Indian Society of Landscape Architects. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question too. Yes, at the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, actually, from the very beginning, the principles with which my father set it up were pro-nature, pro-poor, and pro-women. And therefore, all the projects need to pay attention to the environment and ecology, to people's livelihoods and their economic security, and also to food and nutrition security. And so, taking a holistic view of the community development as a whole is what we believe in. I think it's become even more urgent now. And for example, the marine environment is something that a lot of people are not even aware of. But we have a center in Pumpuhar in Nagapattinam district, and the amount of marine pollution, that is there because of the ghost nets and a lot of the plastic that goes from the cities into the oceans, basically destroying life, in the water. And so I think nature-based solutions is one way where the IUCN, for example, promotes nature-based solutions as a way of addressing both climate change, but also improving the lives of people on the ground. So I think every solution has to look at both aspects. We can't sacrifice environment for people or people for the environment. So that's the balance, we have to find. But again, I think traditionally our forefathers lived like that. And so even though the population today is much more, there should be a way, I think, of finding a balance.
One final question. Any student, if you're around, would like to ask, we'll give it to a student if that's okay.
Student.
Sure. Wonderful.
Yeah. So nice to see you in person, ma'am. I am a PhD scholar at IIT Bombay studying child malnutrition. So, ma'am, in regards to climate change, we really have a difficulty of measuring the impact of the actions we take today and the impact which will come in future. So I came across the work of Lomborg, a German scientist. They established a team of economists, many of them Nobel Prize winning economists, and they studied all the major challenges that we as a world face today. And what is the cost benefit analysis for it. And climate change not even came on the list. Child nutrition came first, so, and this is on one hand. We also have that India's nutrition status, as you mentioned, also performing very bad. Maharashtra, where we are sitting, NFHS 5 shows worst performing state in terms of childhood stunting. So since we as a, system or government perform only better if we focus on limited issues at one point of time. So should, in India even have climate change as one of the priorities? That's my question, ma'am.
So climate change is, I think it's here. It's not a question of should we or should we not have it as a priority. It's here. You have to live with it. The thing is the understanding of climate change, the word climate change, for many years, we saw images of polar bears stuck on icebergs, right, with nowhere to go. And so I thought, okay, climate change is affecting that poor polar bear, But you have to think about nutrition. Climate change is going to make malnutrition worse. It's going to make our floods and droughts worse. It's going to make we have people dying because of heat already. Unfortunately, our records don't record it as a heat-related death because that's a problem. We don't have a very good system of recording the cause of death, particularly in rural areas. And so we're not able to capture exactly what the morbidity and mortality is. But I think it's a reality. So to me, it's not even a question that should we take climate change, because each of the things that you mentioned, including nutrition, is linked. 30 years from today, if we want a well-nourished and a healthy population, we need to think about our agricultural strategies today and modify them. Otherwise, if we keep doing the same things we're doing now, we probably will be even faced with more food shortages in the future. So it is going to impact, I think, all aspects. And so sometimes direct connection is there, sometimes it's a very indirect connection, but it is very much there.
Before we conclude, Dr. Kakotkar would like to add something. Sir, may I just request you to say a few words?
Well, thank you. I think this issue is such that you address 10 questions and 100 questions arise. So probably that's the trend. Now, the same way, Dr. Jadhav raised this question about ethics, rapidity with which things are happening. How does governance cope up with the fast-changing scenes? Now, these are all very difficult questions, and while it may be very easy if I sit alone in some remote corner to think about it and find a solution, give some sermon to the world, but to make the world adopt those solutions or their own solutions which are right is a bigger problem. So I can't hesitate but to kind of seek your opinion. I know, I don't know, he didn't expect me to ask a question, but let me. and that is, since you have seen science at the international level, WHO, many of these problems, not only in health, other areas as well, you said Mahatma Gandhi's quote, there is enough for everybody, but not enough to satisfy greed of people. I think that applies also to nations, just as it applies to individuals. And the problem is there is this mad competition between nations. And well, that goes on at one place, but the poor nations of the world get ground very badly in this situation. So my point is, just like climate change, whether it is real or not real, finally it was that great committee of IPCC, several scientists of the world sat together. Initially, I would say most of the world didn't believe them, but slowly now everybody says it's real. Should there not be an international group of scientists duly recognized by United Nations or some such body to really look at this issue? The technology is moving so fast. There are ethics issues on one side, but there are also issues of governance. How do you govern? The question was raised about AI governance. I would say many other technologies, this issue will come. Long time back, people were talking about geoengineering as a solution, and they gave up because you don't know enough. So, since you have seen WHO from almost the apex level, is it possible that a body of international scientists could sit together and address this question and put some restraint on this mad competition that is going on?
Yes, sir. I think you've raised a very fundamental question, and it's a very deep issue, and I'm sure you have a lot of experience also with the international bodies that regulate nuclear proliferation, for example, chemical weapons. So there have been those created to look at those specific issues. The world is trying to negotiate a pandemic treaty now, and the basis of that pandemic treaty was so that countries will cooperate and not be nationalistic and in competition during a pandemic as to who can get the most vaccines or the most products. That negotiation does not seem to be going very well. So unless there's some... So I think the world has changed, and even the way that the UN today is effective or not effective, then it raises a lot of questions about global governance. But I strongly agree with your proposal that a group of scientists, independent scientists, who are not politically influenced, like the IPCC, should be set up to regulate new technologies, or to at least make frameworks that can be then adopted. And the UN Secretary General did appoint somebody as his ASG to actually do, I believe he did it to do that. And we have an Indian sitting there, actually, Mr. Amandeep Gill, who's an IFS officer. So I don't know if they'll be able to succeed at that level, but I think this seems to be the only way forward, I think, because at least there's some credibility associated with a scientific group.
So now I do the job he asked me to do, and that is to say it was great having you here and talk to all of us, share your insights in such a wide subject to be dealt with in hour or so is, I think, quite tough. But thanks very much for at least making people think. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, thank you, Dr. Swaminathan. It's been incredible listening to you. As Dr. Kakodkar said, there could have been 100 more questions, and I do hope we will see you back here very soon. Although some of our students have just started leaving in a hurry. 1 second, 1 minute. We'll give you one question. Just let me say my piece, okay? We would love to have you back. We've got an amazing body of institutions in Mumbai, which are also doing a lot of amazing research, who would greatly benefit. The YB Chavan Center itself has an amazing body, 30 years of work across sectors, and we would like to learn from you. Thank you so much for sparing time for this interaction, and we do hope to see you soon again. We will be heading down for the function, for the National Award function. Please remain seated. There's one gentleman who would like to ask one final question as an exception, if that's okay, ma'am.
Hello, ma'am. Myself, Tushar Patil. I am a UPSC aspirant. It was a very insightful discussion. My question is, ma'am, sir has talked about $5 trillion economy, and economy and environment is always at the crossroads, right? But my question is, हम लोग जो कॉन्फ्रेंसेस होती है पेरिस से लेकर शर्म एल शेख से और यूएई तक, हम लोग डिस्कशन, डिबेट्स और डिलीबरेशंस के आगे कब बढ़ेंगे, और जो लिप सर्विस करते हैं उसके आगे कब बढ़ेंगे? क्योंकि हम लोग अभी यहाँ पे जितने भी डिग्निटरीज आएंगे वो अपने अपने व्हीकल से आएंगे, राइट? इन फॉरेन कंट्रीज रिच पीपल आर यूजिंग देयर पब्लिक ट्रांसपोर्ट, तो इनके गाड़ी से तो इमिशन हो रहा है, तो वहां पे हम लोग बड़े बड़े सेमिनार्स में जाके डिस्कशन, डिबेट्स और डिलीबरेशन करते हैं, तो एक्चुअल में तो दिखना चाहिए ना ग्राउंड पे. अ मैसेज हैज गॉन टू माय यूथ जनरेशन कि हम लोग यंग जनरेशन को, जो से आपने कहा, को क्या मैसेज जा रहा है? दैट इज माय क्वेश्चन. थैंक यू.
नहीं, आपने बहुत सही प्रश्न किया है. तो ऐसे प्रश्न आप लोग करेंगे तब हमारी जनरेशन थोड़ा सोचेगी अपने बिहेवियर को बदलने में. तो बिहेवियर को तो बदलना है, जरूरी है. हम लोग सबको करना पड़ेगा, करके दिखाना पड़ेगा, क्योंकि अगर सब सोचेंगे कि वो बदलेंगे, हम तो ऐसे ही रहेंगे, तो फिर कुछ नहीं बदलेगा जिंदगी में. तो थैंक यू वेरी मच. मैं यही बोल सकती हूँ कि आपका सवाल बिल्कुल ठीक सवाल.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We invite you to attend the award function. It starts at 5 o'clock on the ground floor. Thank you.